Thank you, Professor Oklobdzija, for joining us on the podcast today. It's really great to have you. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. We haven't done an episode on housing policy or economic policy in quite a while, so it's great, especially to have a visiting professor give us his expertise. That being said, I'd like to jump straight into the first question to get our conversation going. Before we dive into the nitty gritty and the details of the housing crisis in the market right now, can you first kind of paint a picture and lay out the foundation of where the market is right now and how we ended up here?
Cool. Well, hey, Kevin, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on the podcast. So it's a big question about, what the current markets are and how we came to be here, right? So, housing markets are very regional, right? They sort of differ from place to place. So there's kind of a variety of housing markets depending on what region of the country you're thinking of, right? Cities like Cleveland or Detroit or Buffalo, sort of these old Rust Belt cities that have been experiencing extreme depopulation since about the 1970s or 80s or so, have fundamentally different housing markets than some of these big superstar cities like San Francisco or New York or Los Angeles, right? So it really depends on what you're talking about, though we're starting to see kind of a grand convergence of housing markets across the nation. And what I mean by that is, the fundamental thing that defines housing markets in a lot of these jobs-rich centers of the United States is fundamental scarcity, right? For about the last 50 years or so, cities across America have not been building to meet demand and to meet population growth, right? There's a variety of reasons for that, which I assume we're going to get into on the podcast, right? But cities that haven't ever seen a housing crisis before, cities like Boise, Idaho, or Spokane, Washington, are currently seeing housing prices shoot up astronomically and start mirroring places like the Silicon Valley or West Los Angeles, right? So these new jurisdictions are having to deal with the ramifications of a housing shortage for the first time in almost their entire history of incorporation.
That's really interesting. I think it's especially interesting because I like the fact that you point out that they're, depending on the region of the country, San Francisco and West LA are totally different than some of these other areas. But the fact that you're noticing, these increases in areas you might not normally expect is definitely concerning. You mentioned the shortages. I think that's really a really important point to talk about. Can you maybe expand on why there are shortages in the first place?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, since we're Californians, we have to start here at home, right? We have to sort of like pretend that everything stems from California. So, there's a long history of housing development, regulated housing development in the United States, right? I mean, there was once upon a time where pioneers would just kind of set down a little thing kind of willy-nilly, and cities sort of evolved organically from there. But around the turn of the 20th century is when cities start introducing zoning codes for the first time, right? Now, a lot of these zoning codes were ostensibly to segregate sort of noxious uses away from places where people live, so people wouldn't want like an animal rendering plant or like a steel mill next to where they slept, right? But these zoning codes quickly sort of were gobbled up by sort of the other pervading policy goal of America around the turn of the 20th century, and that was segregation, explicit racial segregation. So cities across America have these explicitly racist zoning codes that segregate portions of the city by race, right? So Los Angeles has these strict zoning codes. Actually, San Francisco is the first city with one of these zoning codes designating where Chinese people can live in the city and where they can't, right? But these are quickly mirrored across the country depending on which sort of non-white ethnic group is there, right? These get shot down in 1917 in a Supreme Court decision called Buchanan v. Worley, and that was out of the city of Louisville in Kentucky. Right, they had specific ordinances banning African Americans from living in certain parts of the city. Right, so in 1917, racially explicit zoning is shot down, but it doesn't by any means signify that cities stopped viewing explicit racial segregation as a policy goal. So my hometown of Berkeley, California, comes up with an ingenious solution, right? If you can't explicitly segregate people, right? And Berkeley had a growing African American population and Asian American population at the time. You can't explicitly segregate people by race. You can do the next best thing and segregate by income, right? Given that there's a high correlation between race and income in the United States, even today, but especially 100 and some odd years ago, right? Essentially segregating by wealth gave you racial segregation by proxy. So Berkeley invents a type of zoning that becomes the dominant land use form across the United States, which is single family detached residential. And what that means is that housing economics essentially boils down to parcels of land, right? Little subdivided pieces of a city and the structures that occupy those pieces of land, right? So as a city becomes more populous and land becomes more valuable, right? There's more demand on each piece of land. Rational economics would indicate to us that a developer would build more units of housing upon a single piece of land, right? You can take this expensive land, you can cut the costs across a bunch of people. The developer turns a profit, people have lower cost means of living and everyone's happy, right? Well, Berkeley sort of inverts that logic by mandating that only one unit of housing can be built on certain parcels of land. This is in the Claremont development. For those that know Berkeley, this is kind of in South Berkeley, right by the gates to UC Berkeley, right? Big case involving UC Berkeley for a time having to cut their admissions because of an environmental lawsuit brought by a local anti-houser in the city actually takes place in that neighborhood. So it's like what is old becomes new again. So anyways, single family zoning becomes the dominant land use forms as more and more cities sort of pick up on this insight from Berkeley that you can achieve racial segregation through your zoning code and not through explicit racial division, right? Further Supreme Court cases and further changes to federal and state law also preclude explicit segregation, right? 1948, there's a big case called Shelley v. Kramer, which outlaws cities enforcing what are known as racially restrictive covenants, right? This idea that you can restrict the sale of certain pieces of property to members only of certain races, right? And then in 1968, the Federal Fair Housing Act shoots down these covenants altogether, right? So we inherit this land use form that comes from eras of explicit racial segregation, though that isn't the stated policy these days anymore, right? That's where the stated intent of the policy anymore. The policies do remain, right? And because of this, we have land use forms that are codified into city zoning codes, such as single family detached housing, that are extremely inefficient uses of land, right? In the 1970s, several California cities follow up on this trend with what are called massive down zonings, right? So San Francisco reduces the permitted density in certain parts of like the Haight neighborhood, right? They start reducing them to like fractions of what their zone capacity was, right? Los Angeles does this really dramatically throughout the 1960s and reduces its zone capacity from 10 million people to about 4 million people by about 1980, right? Coincidentally, Los Angeles's actual population now is right around 4 million, right? The city of Los Angeles has a vacancy rate of about 2.5% at current, right? And you don't have to be, you don't need a PhD to understand that, if a lot of people are competing for scarce vacant units, this is going to drive prices through the roof. And this is largely what we're seeing today in a nutshell.
That's really interesting. I think, when people have this conversation, when I've had this type of conversation with others, a lot of the times we wrongly assume that something has happened policy-wise or something happened to the market in the last 5, 10, 15 years that's impacting, the reason why we have these shortages and the reason why prices are skyrocketing. But it's really interesting to hear that this has been really in the making for a really, really long time. And the policies that were in place 50, 60, 100 years ago still have an effect today. Even if those policies themselves don't exist, the impact of them and what they did to specific regions, that impact is still seen today. And that really complicates, solving the issue, because on the surface, you can say, well, those policies that enforce segregation, various forms of segregation don't exist anymore, in that same capacity. Yet you can still clearly tell, what areas have been impacted by that. Kind of going along on that point, how has COVID changed any of this? And a lot of these kinds of conversations, the question of, how did COVID change this comes up. So how has COVID changed this, if at all? And not only that, given the fact that we're now in 2022, it's been over 2 years since COVID. Have we seen any changes in these past 2 years, maybe as a result from, people being able to go back to work? How has COVID impacted the housing markets, but also how has the fact that we're kind of moving out of that COVID quarantine era, I should say, impacted as well?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, actually. So COVID comes sort of at the end of this 30-year cycle of Americans moving back into the cities, right? So we see these big downzonings in a lot of American cities around the 1970s. New York City has these dramatic downzonings in the 1970s as well, right? Into the 1980s. And around the mid 1990s or so, Americans start to see a premium, I guess, in quotes, of city living again, right? So this era of white flight that starts at the end of World War II with government policies designed to give returning veterans low interest loans in the suburbs, right? I should say low interest loans only to white veterans, right? African Americans who served in the military in World War II were ineligible. And a lot of these new subdivisions were built with racially restrictive covenants, right? So things like Levittown and all of these other sort of big boom burbs from the 1950s, like the Wonder Years kind of development, those were shut off to non-whites. So anyways, this period of white flight starts coming to a close around the 1990s as there's a bunch of competing explanations of why. It's sort of an open question amongst economists. Some people say that commute times have gotten too high. There's a big drop in crime, in urban crime around the 1990s that suddenly makes cities a lot more attractive, right? And so people start moving back into the cities, right? Cities are always Americans' job centers, right? There's this sort of natural allure that these big superstar cities have because there's a lot of employment there, right? There's not really sort of any magic reason why people choose to flock to Southern California, for example, right? That's just one of America's job centers. I forget the statistic exactly, but something like 50% of America's GDP comes out of like 9 or 10 metropolitan statistical areas, right? So I mean, there's just not much work for you like out in the fields of Oklahoma, I guess, unless you're an oil miner or something like that, or I don't know. So anyways, in the 1990s, there's this big sort of return to the cities, right? So people start going back into the cities. Cities previously had this sort of expansive sort of vacant housing market around the 1990s, just because of all the people, all of the rapid depopulation for people decamping to the suburbs, right? So, rents were sort of low. This is kind of the era of like, the kind of fiction from the late 90s CC of like urban bohemians and that sort of thing, like living in a loft down in the meatpacking district of New York or out in the Mission district of San Francisco or something like that, right? So, there's sort of abundant vacant housing, rents are relatively low, but the party kind of comes to a close around the 2000s, especially in certain cities here in the West Coast around the dot-com boom, right? So the San Francisco Bay Area suddenly has this explosion of new tech jobs around the mid to early 2000s, right? Which continues on into the 2010s, right? And so this lack of building really starts catching up with cities at that point, right? So this is when you start to see vacancy rates really declining in cities that have sort of experienced a jobs boom of various types, finance in New York, tech out in San Francisco, et cetera, right? So, the 2010s were a really, really bad year for the housing crisis in American cities, right? This is sort of when this crisis really came to a head. You started seeing extreme declines in low-income populations from America's most expensive cities, right? The sort of rise of what people call gentrification, right, or economic displacement. This really starts to pick up across America around the 2010s, right? And continues until 2020 when COVID hits, right? So what COVID does, it actually just is kind of a weird, big quotes, natural experiment, sort of a social science term of art, in that, you know, COVID sort of comes randomly out of a jungle in Wuhan, China, right? And it's not sort of like any sort of government intervention that precipitates it, right? So like all of a sudden, demand in American cities, demand for housing drops, right? People are getting laid off, restaurants have closed, offices have closed, everyone's going work from home, right? So a lot of this pressure on cities, right, on the city's housing markets is alleviated during COVID, right? I mean, for horrendous reasons that we should not really wish to replicate ever again. I mean, at least I hope we don't ever replicate this for as long as I'm alive. Just, mass deaths, just sort of business failings left and right, something, we hopefully have put in our past, knock on wood. But it sort of shows the sort what effect that demand has on these finite and constrained housing markets of a city, right? So during COVID, right, rents in American cities plummet, right, as suddenly landlords are fighting for tenants for their buildings, right? I mean, during COVID, I lived in downtown Los Angeles, and I literally moved across the alley from a 1-bedroom to a brand new 2019 built building, right, like a skyscraper, for literally the exact same price that I was paying for a crappy 1-bedroom, right? So I mean, like, if you had a stable income around COVID, like, it was really a buyer's market. Vaccines come, the COVID stimulus happens, the start of the Biden presidency. Eventually, hiring starts again, and there's this new demand for cities, right? So what we see is vacancy rates in American cities starting to plummet again. And with that drop in available stock, we see prices starting to climb. But what COVID's also done is it's distributed the American workforce away from cities in a way we hadn't seen before, right? So it's given rise to a new phenomenon of remote work, right? And people are choosing maybe to live in a lower cost area, a place where they can have more space, more access to outdoor amenities, et cetera. So it's causing these housing crises in cities that really don't have these superstar industries that cities that had previously had a housing crisis you sort of have within their borders, right? So for example, Bozeman, Montana is having an enormous housing price spike currently, right? I mean, Bozeman, Montana, it's a really nice city. It's kind of a college town, but it's really not much bringing people to the place, right? But if you can work for Google and, work for anywhere with internet, right? Like suddenly Bozeman becomes kind of attractive, right? This is actually really wreaking havoc in a lot of American resort towns. Aspen, Colorado is having a similar problem right now because remote workers are taking up all the short-term rental housing that previously workers at these resorts used, right? These resort cities in Colorado and the mountains in general are extremely resistant to adding new housing, right? Like if you propose putting an apartment complex there, it's like the apocalypse has landed or something like that. And I guess we can talk into like the sort of the political reasons behind this housing shortage, I guess in a little bit. But yeah, COVID has definitely spread the population of American workers out a lot more, and it's sort of leading to housing crises in cities that hadn't seen them previous.
That's really interesting. The one point that you made, I thought that was really fascinating, and I hadn't even begun to think of, was how remote work would impact this. And I never even considered the idea that now that remote work is a lot more acceptable, and some companies are totally okay with you working from, from long distances, it totally kind of flips the landscape on its head. And you start noticing, like you mentioned, like cities that in the past would, you would never have thought would experience housing crises are now experiencing them. Normally this topic, you think of like, big cities are, the first kind of area you would think to have these phenomena exist. But when it's happening in areas because of remote work, it really makes you take a step back, because you realize that it's not just, it's a multifaceted issue, and different factors can have, different impacts on where people want to live, where people are choosing to live, where demand is. On that point of remote work, this might be a question that, is difficult to answer right now, but I think it's interesting to talk about. What do you think is going to happen, moving forward, if remote work becomes more and more accessible and more people choose to work home? Do you think that, the demand to live in cities is the logical conclusion that people will, the demand will go down in terms of, people wanting to live in cities, or will it kind of stay where it is now, where, it's a bit more dispersed? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, that point of remote work kind of becoming the dominant work form and causing demand in cities to drop is like, I think what every NIMBY in California goes to bed praying at night, right? That hopefully people will leave West Los Angeles and the Silicon Valley and San Francisco and just go back to where they came from or whatever. Unfortunately, remote work is really niche. It's a really sort of small subset of the population that can do it, right? It's the really most high SES workers, so like knowledge workers, people that work, like in tech, right? Programmers, people working in marketing, stuff like that. Like maybe those jobs can transition, but the bulk of work that's done in the United States just can't be done remotely, right? Healthcare work has to be in person. Manual labor has to be done in person. The service economy is one of the biggest, economic sectors of a city. That has to be in person, right? There's a lot of sort of gains to having these what are called agglomeration effects, right? Having a lot of smart, capable people together, right? This idea generation. And also, cities are just, kind of a more enjoyable built environment for human beings, right? You're not sort of dependent on a car like you would be in a suburb, right? American suburbs are deliberately designed so that every trip has to be made with a private passenger automobile, right? So if for some reason you can't drive, you don't like to drive, right? That's not the place for you. Cities also sort of have like the advantage of just sort of concentrated cultural amenities. For certain populations, city life is just a lot more comfortable, for example, right? If you're sort of a religious, ethnic, you're a minority, right? LGBTQ person, right? There's a lot more for you in a city than there is out in like the mountains of Montana, right? Or in an American suburb. So cities as a built environment, as an urban form, are here to stay, right? And cities are sort of this dynamic economic engine as well. It's a very, very good problem to have that everyone wants to move to your city, not just from the country, but from around the world, right? It's funny that, no, it's not funny. It's funny, sad, not funny, haha, that in the United States, right, like this problem that we have in big quotes is actually a fantastic opportunity that nations around the world would kill for, right? And we've turned this into one of the biggest economic mobility and civil rights issues in our society. Just kind of absurd.
Yeah, that's a great point to make too. That it is, it's more of those high-end tech jobs, like you mentioned, that would maybe have, an impact on this, but in general, it doesn't. I do want to shift a little bit and talk about some of the politics and policies behind, this entire conversation. In terms of where we are right now, what kinds of policies have been maybe discussed or even implemented to maybe address some of the issues that we've been discussing? Maybe we can focus on policies that are relatively recent, maybe the last 20, 30 years. And have they worked? Which ones haven't? Are there any highlights that you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, so I think we should maybe take a step back first and talk about the policies that got us to this point, right? So we mentioned racially exclusive zoning, right? But one of the fundamental problems that we have in the United States in regards to housing comes from our federalist system of government, right? America, if you think about like a Russian matryoshka doll, like those little sort of dolls that nest, right? We have a multitude of governments, right? Whose goals often come into conflict with each other and whose responsibilities are often divvied up amongst a bunch of different entities with differing motivations, right? So for example, here in California, right, there's an explosion in the number of cities around the 1960s, right? And this is because a city here in Los Angeles County named Lakewood figured out a new arrangement where it could become a city, and cities in the United States, an incorporated city has almost full reign, full jurisdiction over land use decisions that are made in that city, right? So, I mean, you choose how to zone, you could zone. I mean, there's a billion examples of just really absurd zoning rules in cities, right? But like the buck stops there with the local government, right? So what Lakewood figured out how to do was how to incorporate on the cheap, right? The downside to incorporation is that you have to raise all this money for a police department, you got to fix your roads, you got to fix your sewers, you got to get a fire department, all of that stuff, which is expensive, right? Results in high taxes, which people often are. That's kind of our national sport, is complaining about taxes in the United States. So they figured out a way to do it for cheap, which is just contracting services from Los Angeles County. So you get all the benefits of the city with none of the cost, right? And I mean, one of the big reasons why Lakewood wanted to incorporate was because Long Beach was looking to annex that part of unincorporated Los Angeles County into its borders, and people didn't want apartments and African Americans and Latinos as their neighbors in predominantly white Lakewood of the 1960s, right? So there's a big wave of municipal incorporations at this time, right? So we start seeing this thing called municipal fragmentation, right? Where one swath of land is governed by a multitude of different governments, right? There's 88 cities in Los Angeles County, right? Tiny jurisdictions have like 40 or something cities, right? And so every time you cross a boundary, the land use rules are different, right? And elected officials in those cities aren't really thinking about the region as a whole. They're thinking about people within their little border, right? So, I mean, housing and labor is a regional issue, right? It's not something that happens within a city, right? People in Riverside don't just work in Riverside, go to school in Riverside, do all their stuff in Riverside. They live in this region, right? They may go to work in Corona. Their kids might go to school off in Moreno Valley or something like that. Who knows, right? There's just a lot of transit around an area, but municipal fragmentation and American federalism makes all of these big regional decisions into sort of like tiny fiefdoms, right? And so it creates all sorts of bottlenecks to the kind of development that we need for functional integrated regions, right? Here in Los Angeles, we have what's called a bus rapid transit, right? So it's a special lane for a bus that they can go through. They get priority on traffic lights. So they don't have a bus of like 200 and something people getting stuck behind like one dude in a car, right? So it runs along Wilshire Boulevard, right? Sort of the big east-west connector of the city. However, it has to run through Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills is another city. Beverly Hills does not like the idea of buses or mass transit. It might bring poor people into the city, God forbid, right? So in Beverly Hills, there's no bus rapid transit, right? So you can go from downtown Los Angeles to the border of Beverly Hills in about, I don't know, let's say like 30 minutes or so on the bus, but just transversing 2 miles of Beverly Hills is an additional 30 minutes, right? So like the time it takes to go, I don't know, like 8 miles is the same as the time it takes to travel 2. And this is a result of municipal fragmentation, right? So when you think about this, right, elected officials in these tiny regions don't get reelected by doing what's good for the entire region, for the Inland Empire, right? For the San Francisco Bay Area. They get reelected by doing what's good, not just in their tiny little city, but in their tiny little district, right? And so an elected official, right? I mean, it's an axiom of political science that a elected official's singular goal is re-election, right? They just want to be in office for as long as possible. Well, who do they target? Well, if you're smart and if you want to continue being in power, you target the people that are the most active voters, that are the most active donors, and that have the most resources to help you win a campaign. Who is that in American cities? And that's homeowners, right? Homeowners have this rapidly appreciating asset, right, that renters don't have. I mean, when you pay rent, that money just kind of disappears into the ether, right, into your landlord's pocket. If you own a home, there's equity, right? So you make your mortgage payment, right? But that house appreciates in value. So you're building wealth, right? Like the way a renter isn't, right? Homeowners have longer tenures. So they're in place for a longer amount of time. It means like they've registered to vote, they've gotten used to voting, they understand local politics, they have bigger networks of other people, they can motivate their neighbors to work, right? So you see this phenomenon that a group of political scientists at Boston University called neighborhood defenders, right? They're people that show up to city council meetings with the specific goal of blocking any change in their neighborhood, right? One reason they do this is because they want to keep the demographic component of their neighborhood the same, right? They want white neighborhoods to stay white in a lot of cases. Another reason is just pure economics, right? There's an economist at the University of Pennsylvania, I believe, William Fischel, wrote this book called The Home Voter Hypothesis. And it's, if you have 50% of your wealth tied into a home, which the average American does, you're going to want to defend that thing at all cost, right? So what do you do to defend it? Well, you block competition. You own a scarce asset. That asset appreciates more rapidly than if it's a commonplace asset, right? So those sort of political institutional arrangements make developing new housing difficult, right? Because housing has to occupy a piece of land, right? And you have all of these tiny little kind of fiefdoms around whose entire goal is blocking it. So where does housing get cited? Well, normally housing gets cited then in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. These were places that were previously zoned for multifamily housing, right? And it gives rise to this idea that these new buildings are what's causing gentrification in these neighborhoods, when actually it's the supply crunch, right? And it's the institutional arrangements that give people with higher socioeconomic status more ability to block housing, right? Developers aren't dumb. They're going for the path of least resistance, right? If the land is already zoned for multifamily housing, right, which it's not in most American cities, right, and the people there don't have money for lawyers to sue the developments, then you're going to stick it there because it's just a lot easier, right? Time is money, and you maximize your returns by minimizing your construction times.
I think that was a really, really great overview on the policy and political aspects of it. And I think the point that you made about how, especially in LA is a really good example about how, you go a few miles and you're technically in another city, and the policies are totally different there. And based on what that city, demographics are, the average income, the policy makers in that specific city, their incentive again is just, like you mentioned, to stay in office, and they're only going to go after the people that will actually, keep them in office. Mm-hmm. And that poses a really massive problem if you're trying to build multifamily, units in these areas, because the policymakers don't have any real incentive to do that, when the most important constituents for them are the homeowners. And so it really becomes, I think it's a really great framework to use, that it's really a systemic issue that isn't discussed enough, because I think a lot of times, we don't talk about the nuances about how the way the system is built, and how it really is a systemic issue. And if you don't address those issues, if you don't talk about those aspects of the problem, then you really aren't able to, if your goal is to build more multifamily units, you can't really do that if you're not talking about how certain areas like Beverly Hills is a great example, have zero, their homeowners don't want that, and their elected officials, their constituents don't want that. And so they have no incentive to do that. And I think that's a really important point to highlight, but it's also really challenging to resolve as well. And it really makes sense, now why so many cities have trouble, finding support and funding for to build multifamily units, because it does get discussed a lot. Multifamily housing is something that I've heard increase in terms of how often people talk about it, but in terms of massive change, it doesn't really happen. And that really, the way you framed it was really, really effective, I think. So I know we're getting close to the end of our time. I did want to ask a kind of a closing question. So given everything we talked about, the policy, the history, the COVID, all of that, what are some points that you would like to kind of end things on? What do you think is going to happen? Is a question that economists will always talk about, how we don't know what's going to happen, but what are your ideas on things moving forward in terms of the rest of this year, and hopefully as we kind of get close to the end of the COVID era? And also, are there any policy ideas that you've seen maybe discussed or researched that you think are intriguing in terms of helping tackle some of these issues?
Yeah, no, definitely. So, I mean, it's both good news and bad news. I mean, the bad news is that this crisis has reached from almost existential dimensions here in California, right? For the first time in the history of our state, we lost a congressional seat during the last census count, right? There is an exodus of primarily lower income and people of color from California to lower cost states like Texas or Arizona or Nevada, right? Which has tremendous implications in today's America, right? Where red states are severely curtailing civil and political rights of ethnic and racial minorities, right? So, I mean, California's intransigence on housing and refusal to do the right thing is having drastic, serious consequences over people's lives, right? So the problem is huge, and it's readily apparent in California. And to a certain extent, that's kind of the good news, right? This has become a problem that people can't ignore anymore. So we're seeing a lot more attention, a lot more resources, and a lot more political organizing around the idea, around the area of housing and the idea of creating more housing abundance, both in California and nationally, right? This has become an issue in a lot of political races, right? San Francisco had a special election for its assembly district a couple of months ago, right? And that race sort of hinged around the idea of the yes in my backyard candidate versus the not in my backyard, the NIMBY candidate, right? So this is becoming a bigger and more salient issue in California, which gives me a lot of hope about our future, right? And one of the big tactics that organizers and operatives in the pro-housing movement are taking is removing this land use authority from local governments, right? What we've seen, I mean, since the 1930s, when local governments were vested with this power of zoning by the Supreme Court decision of Euclid v. Ambler, what we've seen is literally a century of abusing this authority, right? It's abusing this authority to create racially homogenous enclaves, to create economically homogenous enclaves, to hoard opportunity and resources away from underprivileged people. I mean, the last 100 years of locally controlled zoning in the United States has been nothing but abject failure, right? So one of the big pushes right now is to create uniform sets of zoning and uniform sets of land use that apply to entire regions, right? Beverly Hills does not get to make its own land use code, right? Cities like Atherton up in the Bay Area don't get to have minimum parcel sizes of 1 acre, which if you think about that, that's absurd how large that is, right? I mean, there's no wonder why housing prices are astronomical in that city, right? So what these policies seek to do is to create uniform standards that everyone has to abide by. This removes a lot of this discretionary authority from local governments, which in the past has just been a magnet and breeding ground for municipal corruption, right? If there is one elected official or a group of elected officials that have make or break say over a multi-billion-dollar project, well, then some money is going to find their way to grease the palms of those elected officials. And that's what we saw recently here in Los Angeles, the case of Jose Huizar, who's currently on trial for a raft of corruption charges, federal corruption charges. So creating uniform standards has been the big push, right? And so a couple of examples of that have been a bill called SB 9, which passed in California last year, right? SB 9 eliminated single family zoning across the state of California, right? Cities can no longer zone only for single family, but have to abide by certain conditions that let people split their lots in two and create up to 4 dwelling units per parcel. Now, cities are fighting this tooth and nail, but we've had great representation from Attorney General Rob Bonta, who's taken a lot of these cities to court, right, to force them to stop doing things like Pasadena wanted to declare the entire city a historic district to get around the provisions of SB 9. So these rules, there's currently rules that would curtail the ability of cities to institute parking minimums, right? So X number of parking spaces per, X or Y square feet of commercial, or number of bedrooms residential, or et cetera, right? These ways that cities make housing more expensive such that they can preserve the exclusivity of the community. So building uniform standards or creating uniform standards, right? Creating what's called a by right process of development, such that if you meet these certain conditions, your project gets approved. It doesn't go to scoping. It doesn't go to endless commission meetings. You don't have to create all sorts of expensive consultant-driven documents over it. You can just build. This is the way it's done across the developed world, except for the United States and Anglophone countries to a lesser extent. Right. So those sorts of policies will help us get out of this housing shortage, right? Because, the government can and should step in with publicly funded housing, right? The crisis to the point that we need government intervention, but the government can't make up, nor should it even try to make up, this enormous deficit that we have. I mean, it would bankrupt the entire government, right? It would cost, Los Angeles could spend its entire municipal budget as it is solely on housing and not even make a dent in the problem, right? So we need to change the rules such that market rate housing is built to alleviate this deficit, right? And at the same time, step in with strong protections for tenants, right? So that tenants who are sort of, lacking in bargaining power given low vacancy rates aren't abused by rapacious landlords, and also creating opportunities for social or public housing, right? California recently had a bill, AB 2053, which unfortunately was shot down by several sort of not in my backyard oriented elected officials, Bob Hertzberg here in Los Angeles being sort of one of the more prominent NIMBYs of the California legislature, who's now running for Board of Supervisors, was one of the deciding votes to shoot down AB 2053. But further bills like that are in the pipeline, right? So, as this problem becomes worse and worse and worse over the coming years, right? When California is on track to have a median home price that's north of $1 million in the next couple of years, right? As this problem gets worse, the solutions and the motivation to pass these solutions is going to become greater, right? People are going to start thinking about housing more when they vote. And hopefully this is going to be a signal to people in office that you can't sort of go with the status quo anymore, right? The status quo is broken. It's not working for the vast majority of Californians who didn't buy a home in the 1980s or 90s, right? It's impoverishing an entire generation of Californians, no matter if you're born rich or poor. And this just has to stop. This is an unsustainable and untenable status quo. So, there's a lot of energy in this movement, and I think we're going to see big things coming out of it pretty soon.
That's a great way to end the episode on. Like you mentioned in the beginning, an existential crisis is reaching levels that we've never seen before. But you got to hit rock bottom to go back up. And I think that even though it is impacting so many lives, even that there are more discussion around it, more people talking about it, and government is starting to note that this is something that can't go unaddressed, and that cities having this authority and the way they try to get around these policies, it's not, it can't be like this anymore. It affects too many lives, and it's hurting the state. Like you mentioned, for the first time ever, California lost a seat, and that's huge. So, it's a difficult place, but hopefully, we can turn things around in the coming years. That being said, Professor Oklobdzija, thank you so much for joining me on Policy Chats to discuss this extremely important topic. It was an honor to have you on today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really had a really good time. Thanks so much.